Welcome to Someone's Gotta Drive. I want to put a warning out there that this podcast can be triggering to some. We speak about addiction, childhood trauma, and, parents, more specifically, parents with addiction problems. Towards the end of senior year, I had gotten another boyfriend who went to a different school than me. We met at the grocery store that I worked at. I was living with my uncle. He had some rules which were understandable. One of the rules was I needed to be home by midnight. This boyfriend lived on the way from the grocery store to my uncle's house, and one night he was keeping me quite late, and I kept saying I have to go. I was just swinging in to say hello after my shift at the grocery store. I probably got out of work around 10:30, so it was just a quick hello and a quick goodbye. And on my way there, the road to his house actually was shut down because of a pole down. So I had to go a different way. And that different way was this kind of gravel road in the middle of nowhere. You had to drive really slow on it. And it wasn't like a sopping wet day, but it had been a rainy day. So it was just a bit slick out. I wasn't speeding or anything like that. When I left, I was like, look, I gotta go. And if I was a few minutes late, I was a few minutes late. I knew that I couldn't speed down this part of the road. If I needed to speed a little bit, I could do that on the highway or whatever, but not around this back road. And so I had misjudged this turn in those backwoods on that gravel road. And I had two options. Either I was going down almost a cliff, or I was going to hit this muddy embankment. So I decided to just hit the muddy embankment. Figured, what would it hurt? I'll just, pretty much bounce off of it and then just keep on going. But instead, my tire rolled up that muddy embankment and my car flipped onto its roof. I got really lucky, let me be clear. I got so lucky. One of the other rules my uncle had was to get a cell phone. My dad did not want me to have a cell phone because they had known someone who had never smoked and never drank and ended up with mouth and brain cancer, and they're convinced that it was due to cell phones. Let's remember, this is 2003. Cell phones were not that prominent, and the ones that were those big, hulky, big things, or those little Nokia phones. They weren't the smartphones that we have today. And when when my uncle told me to get one, it was mostly for me not to run up his long distance bill, but it was also in case of emergencies. If something happened to me, he wanted me to be able to get a hold of him. So I got the phone. But when I got into this accident, I couldn't find the phone. So I walked about a mile back up to my boyfriend's house and woke him up and his mother and said, I had just been in an accident and I kind of need some help. I was too afraid to call my family, too afraid to call my uncle, so I found a friend of mine who had a Jeep. And I'm like, hey, do you think you could come out this way, roll my car back over? Let's see if we can get it to start. But if not, maybe drag it up to my boyfriend's house until we figure out what to do. And so his mom insisted that we call the cops and we get everything situated the right way, which is exactly what happened. My friend came out, he rolled my car over, but the cops came out with a tow truck and towed my car back to my parents' house. They even threatened me with ticketing me for reckless driving, but I tried explaining to them that just wasn't the case, that I really just miscalculated this turn and I fishtailed. And it was either the muddy embankment or this cliff, and I chose the muddy embankment. And they were like, well, you did kind of choose right, but you got really lucky. So everyone insisted that I go to the hospital. I decided to let my boyfriend and his mom drive me instead of an ambulance. We did find my cell phone, and I called my parents first on my way to the hospital. I believe I spoke with my mom, but I did talk to my dad, and he said, well, how are you calling me right now? And I said, well, I'm calling you from my cell phone. I was told to get a cell phone. And he said, well, sucks you were in that accident, but I told you not to get a cell phone. So I'm not coming to the hospital. I'm not signing off on anything. I'm not coming to get you. You didn't listen to me. And I said, well, what does it matter? I'm not even living in your house anymore. I'm just calling you because I'm a minor still and you're my parents. Well, sucks to be you. Have a good night. And he rolled back over and fell asleep. So I called my uncle and he came down to the hospital and signed off on the paperwork and took me home. That next day, he took me back to the scene of the accident because he wanted to see where I had this accident, where he tried shaming me and saying, look, here's proof that you were speeding when I wasn't. I just misjudged this sharp turn. Then he took me back to my parents' house where the car had been towed. And honestly, we don't really know how I made it out of this car accident. I know that when I put my seatbelts on, I put them on really tight, and I was definitely hanging when I got into that accident. I was in real shock. But when I tried to get back into the car, gravity must have taken over and kind of helped bring that roof down a little bit more. And honestly, my head did not fit in that car. I was literally an inch away from my skull being bashed in. I got really, really lucky. But I was also on concussion protocol. So for some reason, my dad needed to do something with my uncle back at my uncle's house. So my parents went back to my uncle's house with me as well. And while my uncle and my dad were, doing whatever it was they were doing, my mother was kind of tasked with watching me on concussion protocol. So I wasn't allowed to sleep. I was supposed to rest, but there wasn't really much I could do. And I remember her sitting on the couch across from me and she was like, why won't you talk to me? Why won't you say anything to me? I think this was probably 2 weeks after she had kicked me out. And I was like, you act like me living here still isn't, you kicking me out still isn't a fresh wound. And I honestly didn't really have anything to say. You didn't come for me. You're sitting there pulling my poor baby, my poor baby. You wouldn't even come to the emergency room. In which she looked at me and said, well, your father wouldn't drive me to the emergency room. I was fighting with him, but he said no because you had a cell phone. And I said, I think that's just the pathetic part, is that if I was a mother, nothing would hold me back from getting to my child. And I think that having a cell phone is a pretty petty excuse for not going and making sure that your child is okay when she calls you and says, help, I need you. And you say, sucks to be you. That really hit hard. That was that moment where I realized that I didn't have anybody. All my uncle could care about at that point was shaming me, like shoving a dog's nose into the soiled mess that it made. All he could care about was shaming me. My parents couldn't have given two hoots about me. All they cared about was themselves. It was 1 a.m. when they got that call, and they would not come to help me. I knew then that if I ever needed help again at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, no one was coming for me. So as my mom is like, why can't you be nice to me? Why can't you talk to me? I don't have anything to say. You literally left me on my own devices. I called for help and no one came, except for my uncle, because he was forced to at that point, because he felt responsible for me. And even then, it was begrudgingly. So, and even my uncle was like, you could be a little nicer to your mother. And I was just like, whatever. I took about a month off. I did not feel comfortable driving. I felt like, once again, I wasn't worthy. I tried getting myself back together. I tried looking for work, but I didn't have a car. So the only thing I could really do was go to the local grocery store in the town that we lived in, which was also, once again, about a mile away. I could walk there. I could ride a bike there. So, you know what? I went and got a job there. For the most part, my uncle was pretty happy that I was living with him, at least at first. I cleaned the house. He taught me how to cook meals. But after about a month or two, I started becoming a hindrance to him. I wouldn't wash his clothes because that's not what I did growing up. And I never did that before either. We washed our own clothes at home. We didn't wash mom and dad's clothes. We just washed our own. I didn't always clean up his mess. I made sure to clean up mine so that way I wasn't, an additional hindrance to him. But he expected me to be the woman of the house. He expected me to cook and clean up his messes and that the house should always be clean and spotless because I lived there, on top of having to work. Around this time as well, we found out that my grandmother had been diagnosed with stage 4 esophagus cancer. For years, she had been complaining about not being able to swallow her pills. Finally, she got what is called an upper GI, and they found a 10-centimeter mass in her esophagus. The cancer had spread everywhere. She had not been given very long to live, and about a week or two after that, my grandfather had a massive heart attack and stroke and almost died. I felt like my life was literally crumbling before my eyes, which turned my mother also into a blithering mess. She very much was a daddy's girl. My grandmother and her didn't always see eye to eye and they didn't always get along, but the one thing you could never deny my grandmother was that she loved us intently. I remember my mom messing with like the urine bag while my grandfather was in the hospital, and we were like, don't touch that because the nurse and doctor are they're measuring his urine output to make sure he's okay, and here she is like messing with this kind of stuff, and then I'm being yelled at because I'm telling her not to do something. And it was one of those things where it was like, Mom, I know that you're used to being in the hospital, you should be used to them measuring all this kind of stuff and keeping a close eye on this. But also remember that now you are on the other side of the aisle here. You are now the person watching your parent suffer. You are watching your parent, get cared for by doctors, and you have to know how to navigate that and how to get answers. Because if you are a blithering mess, if you're high, if you're, erratic, they're not going to talk to you. She just never understood that. And I remember once again being told, you're the child, I'm the adult, you don't know what you're talking about. At the same time, my grandmother was, dying from this stage 4 cancer. And I remember her telling us, I had this liver transplant 9 years ago, and they told me I had 5 years left to live. And I'm living 9 years. So every year that I've really gotten after that has been a godsend. I just found it to be extra. I shouldn't have lived this long. And to find out shortly after that 5-year time span, she started drinking again. So that probably didn't help things either. But we don't really know the cause of the cancer. We just know that this is what she had. During this time as well was when I started meeting my uncle's friends. And my uncle was a bachelor, and he had friends too that for the most part were bachelors. And they would come over and they would drink and they would smoke weed, and every now and then they would snort cocaine, and they loved going to like Ozfest and watching football games. And a lot of times I was taken along for the ride. I mean, it was better than being held up in a room all by myself or held up in a house all by myself. But, push come to shove, hindsight being 2020, a 17-year-old girl should probably not be around 40 and 50-year-old single men. Not while they're drinking and doing drugs pretty heavily from time to time. But I was 17, 18 years old almost, and I just knew it as fun. And I was just trying to learn and navigate a new life. And, what does it matter? They didn't have children. They didn't have wives. They didn't have to be responsible for anything. So what was the big deal? When I started working at that grocery store, I also met a new guy. I broke up with the old boyfriend and ended up dating another guy. He was going to be my first husband. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. He was going to be a senior in high school, but he too worked at the grocery store that I worked at. And when I started working at the grocery store, I decided to stop wearing makeup and stop trying to do my hair and to just kind of be this natural person. When I lived with my parents, I always made sure to wear makeup and to straighten my hair and to try to look a certain way. Where here I was like, new me, new life. It is time to just be who I naturally am. And it was kind of nice that, someone liked me for who I was. His parents, on the other hand, did not quite care for me. They thought I was embarrassingly obnoxious, and they didn't really know my full story. And I didn't really want to say my full story. I was ashamed that I had been kicked out of the house and didn't want anyone to think bad of me. But I also didn't think anyone was going to believe my side of the story either. So they gave me their expectations, what they expected from me, how they expected me to act around them, around their family members. And I did everything I could to respect their rules, their boundaries, and do as they asked, because that's what I did as a teenager. I just tried to be a good kid. I understood that their son was 17 years old, still in high school, and living with them. So I had to respect their boundaries and their household. Meanwhile, my grandmother's dying wish was to see one of her grandchildren go to college. So she said she would pay for me to go to college. Now I'm going through the local community college, taking their tests to see where I belonged in their classes to start taking college courses, which is where I also met another friend, closer to my age, and he would help me get to school at night and, we would hang out and things like that. But the problem with being friends with guys when you're a girl at that age is that sometimes guys don't want to just be friends. And that could be problematic, especially when you already have a boyfriend. At the end of that semester, during finals, my grandmother passed away. It was a very difficult time. I was unable to do my finals. When I got the exception to do one at least afterwards, I completely failed it because I couldn't even study for it. That night, I actually went out to go play pool with some friends because what else was there to do? Just sit around the house and cry? Well, apparently that's what my uncle thought, and he was very upset that I wasn't there to sit with him and cry. But you know what? I just didn't have it in me. I needed to get my mind off of everything that was going on because something in me told me everything is about to change. I remember going to work the next day, and I looked a little off because I had been crying that night before. And he says, "Everything okay?" And I said, "Yeah, my grandmother just died yesterday, so I'm just a little off." And he was like, "Why are you here? Go home." And I was just like, my uncle was working. My dad was working. I just assumed I should be working. And they were like, "That's nuts. That's crazy. Go home." My mom's side of the family was actually quite small. For the most part, it was my grandmother, my grandfather, my uncle, my mom, my dad, my sister, and me. We didn't really have anyone to carry her casket even. My boyfriend at the time had sprained his ankle in basketball or something like that. So a friend of mine also came, the one I met in college, and he helped actually be one of the pallbearers to carry my grandmother's casket. But once again, family functions aren't always easy. My sister had a husband, and he was not allowed to go to this family function. So, of course, my sister was ready to head out as soon as possible. We had family that had come from Western Pennsylvania. My sister and I greeted the people as they came into the funeral home. My brother-in-law once again was not allowed to come to his function. So as soon as it was over, my sister pretty much ran back to her house because she really hated being around people who didn't accept her husband. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. My grandmother died on December 7th, 2003. It was just about 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas. That year, I had planned to spend Christmas morning with my boyfriend and his family, being my uncle did not usually celebrate Christmas morning. That afternoon, I would go meet my boyfriend's grandmother for the first time. And then after that, around 4 o'clock, I would go to my parents' house for Christmas. I made these plans weeks in advance, and I made it really clear to everybody what I was doing. However, my mother insisted that everyone was at her house at 1 p.m. for Christmas that day. It was the first time she had been hosting. It was the first Christmas without my grandmother. And that was what she insisted. And very last minute. My uncle gave me a call to make sure I was going to be there. And I said, no, I said I would be there at 4. I made my plans really clear with everybody. He cussed me out up one side and down another, to the point where my boyfriend's dad even heard it, took the phone out of my hand and said, how dare you talk to her that way on Christmas Day? She's not talking to you like that. And he was told to stay out of it. When the phone got handed back over to me, I was told this was my mom's first Christmas hosting. It was our first Christmas without my grandmother. And if I wasn't there at 1 o'clock and my uncle had to hear it, then I was going to be kicked out that very night. So I went ahead and cut my morning short. My boyfriend and I went over to his grandmother's house for me to meet her. I explained the situation and gave all my apologies and met her for the first time. She was a lovely lady. And then I made my way out to my parents' house and honestly stayed there for the bare minimum. My sister was there too, and she did the same thing. She was like, I get it. You made plans and they're just kind of taking advantage of you right now. Once I was done at my parents' house, I drove out to see my boyfriend's mom that night because that was the plan. But that night, he had already talked to his mom and asked if maybe, just maybe, could I come and stay with her? Get out of my uncle's house and, get some reprieve. Because honestly, he was going to kick me out anyways. And no one really liked that I was being talked to that way. I had done nothing wrong. She said yes, but that I could only stay for a short time, simply because she had Section 8 housing, and if anyone found out that I was living there, then she would lose her housing, which made sense. That night, my boyfriend, a friend of his, and I walked into the house, and I screamed, hello, hello, and it sounded like my uncle had a woman in his bedroom. Loud sex going on. And I was like, well, damn. Not for nothing, but he is a bachelor. I don't think I've ever seen him with a woman before, so good for him. But it wasn't for lack of me going, hello, hello, I'm here, I'm here. You can't tell me he didn't hear me. So I started packing all my stuff and moving my stuff out. He finally comes out and he looks at me and goes, what are you doing? And I realize there wasn't a woman in there with him. That was probably some porn video going on. And he's like, oh, what are you doing? I said, well, you threatened to kick me out if I didn't show up. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I pay you rent. Ever since I was 18 years old, I have paid you rent. I have still cleaned your house because those are your rules. I've been home by midnight because those are your rules. But I'm also paying you rent. And I have absolutely no freedom. So if I'm going to pay you rent, then I'm going to do what I want to do. And he said, well, that's not how it works here. I said, great. So I'm going to move out now. I think I'd rather be homeless than deal with this crap. And so I packed up all my stuff, whatever I could fit, put some stuff out to the curb, and I went and moved in with my boyfriend's mom.